how it was the founders' view, as a general kind of big picture view, that ultimately to keep the government within the bounds of the Constitution, it's the responsibility of the people themselves, because the people are the source, the fountain of all power. And so that's the buck stops here kind of mentality, using things like a refusal to comply, outright resistance, and other forms of nullification and interposition. But at the same time, there's a caveat here. At the same time, many of them warned against what they called popular passions and ultimately factions and mob rule. They weren't really into this whole pure mob rule approach either. And I think James Madison is the one of the best examples of this. And I want to cover his views today, starting out here with his take in the Philadelphia Convention. August 31st, 1787, the original Constitutional Convention. And here, Madison reaffirmed what was a totally undisputed view at the time of the founding, that all power comes from the people. They're at the top of the food chain. Here he is. The people were, in fact, the fountain of all power. And by resorting to them, it's a discussion over the mode of ratification. Some people, like Governor Morris, wanted to see each state determine whether it was going to be the state legislature ratifying or however they were going to propose it. But Madison insisted on going to a popular convention, because then this would reaffirm the fact that it was the people of each state making those choices. He said, again, the people were in fact the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. It was a principle in the Bills of Rights that first principles might be resorted to. And of course, when he was 25 years old, he was a delegate to the 5th Virginia Convention in 1776, which gave us the Virginia Declaration of Rights, a foundation of so much more, many parts of the Bill of Rights, some of the Declaration of Independence, and the like. And here's from Section 2. All power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. Magistrates are their trustees and servants and are at all times amenable to them. And here again, Madison, in his speech introducing amendments to the Constitution, this is in June of 1789, his proposal for what he wanted to see, what became the Bill of Rights. But he wasn't proposing a separate Bill of Rights. He was proposing a block of amendments in the body of the Constitution primarily. And he put it this way: the amendments which have occurred to me proper to be recommended by Congress to the state legislatures are these. The first one that James Madison recommended is this. First, that there be prefixed to the Constitution a declaration that all power is originally vested in and consequently derived from the people. So this is Madisonian's, the Madisonian foundation of the Constitution, that the people, again, are at the top of the food chain. And he put it this way a little further in that speech, that government is instituted and ought to be exercised for the benefit of the people, which consists in the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the right of acquiring and using property, and generally of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, that the people have an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform or change their government whenever it be found adverse or inadequate to the purposes of its institution. Sounds a little bit like the principles in the Declaration of Independence, like this, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. So James Madison really drawing on those revolutionary principles. Now, just before the Philadelphia Convention started, James Madison had written some letters to a number of people. I just want to lightly touch on that now. I'll get back to it in just a moment. Some proposals of how he thought the new Constitution, not just amended version of the previous document, but the new Constitution should be formed, what the system was going to be like. And here he is in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, March 19th, 1787, just some weeks before that Philadelphia Convention started. He said, I think myself that it will be expedient in the first place to lay the foundation of the new system in such a ratification by the people themselves of the several states as will render it clearly paramount to their legislative authorities. Again, pointing out that the people are above both the state governments, the local governments, therefore, and the new general government. The people are at the top. And here he is again with a similar principle, arguing in favor of ratification in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June of 1788. He said, by this government, powers are not given to any particular set of men. And I highlighted the word given if you're looking up on the screen and the way I pronounce it as well, because you're not giving away power, because once you give away $50, you don't have any claim to that anymore. If you give your neighbor $50, you're not loaning it. It's the term that you're using. You're not giving it away when you're delegating power, because if the people are the source, the fountain of all power, at most, what they can do is delegate it for a certain amount of time for certain proposed or specifically expressly delegated purposes. And that's how Madison put it. But, sir, by this government, powers are not given to any particular set of men. They are in the hands of the people, delegated to their representatives, chosen for short terms, to representatives responsible to the people. So the people are the boss. And he said, this government, and this is that same speech, this government is not completely consolidated, nor is it entirely federal. Who are the parties to it? The people, but not the people as composing one great body. Now, some people had some issues. Of course, Patrick Henry had some issues with the notion of we the people, and he said, well, shouldn't it be we the states? And Madison is basically clarifying, we're not talking about the people as one unified national blob. We're talking about the people of the several states. Now, if you just say we the states, this could imply that, of course, it's the state governments that are at the top of the food chain. But Madison was reaffirming, again, that revolutionary principle that the people are at the top and they can alter or abolish as they decide. The people, but not the people as composing one great body, but the people as composing 13 sovereignties. He continued, should all the states adopt it, it will then be a government established by the 13 states of America, not through the intervention of the legislatures, but by the people at large. The existing system, which was an issue for them, has been derived from the dependent derivative authority of the legislatures of the states, whereas this is derived from the superior power of the people. Madison sounds like a radical to many of us today. Wow, the people can do whatever the heck they want is ultimately what he's saying. But there's a caveat to Madison's views here. And again, this is in June 11th, 1788. The people at large are the common superior of the state governments and the general government. So it should come as no surprise that in Federalist number 46, when Madison was talking about, and the title of this one is The Influence of the State and Federal Governments Compared. So January of 1788, in the very famous Federalist Papers, of course, they weren't super impactful on the ratification debates at the time. But in the years to follow, certainly people have cited far more influence today than it did then. But it certainly does tell us a lot of Madison's thinking as well, even though he worked on some of this with Hamilton. But Madison had a certain thought. But it should come as no surprise that Madison in Federalist number 46, when he's talking about how to deal with federal overreach, of course, there's a lot of arguments that, well, the feds are just going to run right over the states. And in Federalist 46, he points out, well, they may try, but there's a way to stop them, and it doesn't have anything to do with relying on the federal government to somehow magically limit its own power. It's the people of the several states that can get this done, the people themselves in conjunction with the state governments. So here's how he put it early on in that paper. The federal and state governments are in fact but different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. And again, he has to remind the people that the ultimate authority, wherever the derivative may be found, resides in the people alone. That's how he's kicking it off in Federalist number 46, pointing out, like, if you've got issues with what's going on, the people are the ultimate authority here. So he gave us a 4-step blueprint of how to deal with federal usurpations of power, so an exercise of unwarrantable acts, or unconstitutional, or if they're warrantable but bad policy. And here's how he put it. Should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which may sometimes be the case, The means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. And just for this episode, just focusing on this first part, the disquietude of the people, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So that's the part where the people of each state use things like, well, repugnance. Now, repugnance in this context, if you go through all the dictionary definitions, it leads you to disobedience, but that's, I guess, a different discussion. But he does clearly say a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And then he gives a couple of other steps that also tie in some actions of the state governments. And he said when in a single state, this would make it difficult for the federal government to enforce its acts. Again, whether they're unwarrantable in the view of the people of that state or of the various states in conjunction. So a single state could cause problems. A large state would create very serious impediments. And he said if a number of states took the same approach, it would create an environment which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. And none of these things about dealing with a federal power had anything to do with getting new people in office in Washington, D.C. Well, not at that time, but in the general government. It had nothing to do with using the federal courts to stop the federal government. It had nothing to do with protests against the general government in the Capitol. It was all about action on a state, local, and individual level. So Madison, sounding again like a bit of a radical there, but this was his approach ultimately. Now, at the same time, and I'll get to this in just a few moments, at the same time, he didn't want a scenario where this had to be the norm. He wanted this to be the exception, really. He wanted to create a situation where you didn't have to go to this. And if you had to resort to this type of thing once in a while, it could be very effective. But if you had to resort to it all the time, there might be an indicator of a pretty serious other problem. But again, he went in September or December of 1798, in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. Madison was very influential in drafting the Virginia resolutions of that year. And here's how it started. In case of a deliberate, palpable, well, this is not the very top, but near the top. In case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are party thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. Now, he mentioned a number of times some years later, over a period of essays and things like that, that he wasn't referring to specifically a constitutional right of an individual state to arrest by force, that was his words, the operation of a law, but instead action by the states, plural, as parties to the compact. He said there was an essential distinction between a constitutional right and the natural and universal right of resisting intolerable impression. So you aren't getting this right from the document. He was very clear in saying that the states don't get this right. You don't look to the document itself, but this is a natural right because the states, which are the state governments are creatures of the people themselves. He said, well, let me explain this a little bit further. In his report of 1800, he clarifies that in this situation, in these Virginia resolutions of 1798, he isn't talking about the state governments as making that final choice. He said it means the people composing those political societies in their highest sovereign capacity. So this is, again, James Madison very clearly pointing out that it was the people of the several states at the highest sovereign capacity. Sovereignty means final authority. That was always in the hands of a king or a queen or the king in parliament. They fought a long, bloody war to get away from that. But at the same time, Madison, even though he keeps talking about the people of the several states taking various types of action depending on the scenario, and I'll just give a brief overview of what that is. Even though he was talking about the people themselves taking action to stop the federal government from doing stuff it wasn't supposed to do, he was not a fan of making everything just a pure popularity contest. Again, we're talking about factions and mob rule. And before I get to that, I should mention that we're going to link to Alan Mosley organizes the blog posts for every episode, which is absolutely awesome. I'm very grateful for him stepping up and doing that job consistently every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But he organized that blog post. I do some final checks on it, and we get that published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. You'll be able to find that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We'll also have all the various platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Twitter, X and Facebook, and we're on LinkedIn. We also live stream at rumble.com and odyssey.com, and we have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. If we're missing from a platform that you want to see us on, please make sure to let us know, whether it's in the comments or you can email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyways, let me take a look over in the live chat just for a quick moment here and say hello to everyone here. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. There's Kirk Morrison, Lewis Tart, King Nobody, Dixie Strong, John. This is a public service. That's awesome. Great content, brother, is what he says. I appreciate that as well. Senator DT, Howard, and everyone else. I know I'm scrolling through pretty quickly. Channel 3, Rick in Michigan, and a few others. Thank you so much for being here. I'll take a look over in the chat a little bit later today, maybe a little bit later in the episode, but I do always read through these comments. I get tons of ideas for future episodes, so I appreciate you leaving those comments, and especially if you do it in the archive or leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, etc. This can help us reach more people by triggering algorithms of these platforms, so I appreciate all the feedback for a number of reasons. Anyways, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now let's get back to this. Here again to this letter to Thomas Jefferson. This is James Madison's proposals for how he wants to see the Constitution drafted, the new general government that he wants to put together. This is in early 1787, before the Philadelphia Convention went into effect. Now, he wasn't a fan of making everything just a pure popularity contest. He was very concerned about what he would call mob rule, especially in light of Shays' Rebellion, although I would like to cover that in some detail at some point. I just got to do a little bit more research on it. I'm not a huge expert on Shays itself, but I've been doing a lot of reading on it. I think I'll have an episode on that at some point. But Madison was not a fan of mob rule. He also saw things like paper money and depreciation, what we would call price inflation today, in places like Rhode Island and elsewhere. And in some situations, you can even see Madison talking about things like, well, we got to control the state legislatures. And in that way, if we would have been doing this all along, we wouldn't even have this paper money inflation problem that we're facing right now. So these were things like this were huge motivational sources for supporters of more energy, is what they call it, more centralized or consolidated power under the Constitution versus the Articles of Confederation. Now, of course, I'm not going to get into the opposition on that today, but this is their argument. So he sent this type of a proposal, which I'm going to read to you here in just a moment, to Thomas Jefferson first. Then he sent it down to Edmund Randolph. He sent it to George Washington once he heard Washington was going to be at the convention. But here's one of the top things that needs to be done, according to James Madison. Over and above the positive power of regulating trade and sundry other matters in which uniformity is proper, to arm the federal head with a negative in all cases whatsoever on the local legislatures. And he highlighted, there's actually a footnote here at founders.archive.gov, which will be linked to in the show notes, of course, so you can see it yourself. There's a footnote that says, this is absolutely in Madison's highlight. All cases whatsoever. Those of you who are familiar with the Revolution recognize that in all cases whatsoever is a tip of the hat to the kingly authority, the king in Parliament, the Declaratory Act, where the day of or the day after, I can't recall, I seem to always forget this one, either the day after they repealed the Stamp Act because of resistance and noncompliance by individuals, by colonial governments, etc., the day or day after, they also passed the Declaratory Act, which claimed the power over the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. Everyone from the founding generation, all the old revolutionaries, knew that term. Jefferson certainly knew that term. This is something that was cited over and over and over as really the source of the problem. John Hancock, in his great Massacre Day oration, some years earlier, before, of course, the Articles of Confederation and everything, he said, look, we're talking about problems with taxation without representation, but this is just basically an outgrowth of a problem that we face when they claim power over us in all cases whatsoever. And in the depths of winter in December of 1776, when things didn't look to be going too well, and Thomas Paine started writing his American Crisis papers, he started out the first one with "These are the times that try men's souls." He gets into the point of we can't give up now. It may seem difficult. The odds may be stacked against us. But as long as they claim power over us in all cases whatsoever, we have to push on. So a big part of all the fighting, the war for independence, was against a power over the people in the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And here's James Madison with the audacity to say, on the one hand, the people have all the power, that they're the source of all power. State and federal governments, these are all basically emanations or delegations of power from the people themselves, and they have a right to do what they please. But at the same point, he's also telling Thomas Jefferson, we need the new general or central government to have the authority in all cases whatsoever to have a veto over local legislatures. So that really means, to me, that's saying Madison is either not believing one or the other here. He doesn't believe that the people are the source of all power, or he just thinks they can just delegate the power once and then they need to be controlled afterwards. It's a tough one to comprehend if you put that all together. He says, again, he goes further. Without this defensive power, experience and reflection have satisfied me that however ample the federal powers may be made, or however clearly their boundaries may be delineated on paper, they will be easily and continually baffled by the legislative sovereignties of the states. So he was concerned that no matter what power you gave the general government on paper, unless the federal government was going to have a total absolute veto over all the acts of all the states at all time, no matter what, and still at the same time say that the people are the source of all power and those local legislatures do what they do at the will of the people, in essence. But he's basically saying without that, the states are going to defeat all federal programs. And maybe that's where he gets to with Federalist number 46, because he didn't get what he wanted in the Philadelphia Convention. So he sent this off to Jefferson. Jefferson writes back, this kind of slow process going from France to Philadelphia at that time, and he basically blew it off. He slapped it down just quickly. He says, I don't like it. And even after the convention, I hadn't looked into this before, but I looked for a return just this weekend. I was looking for a return letter from Madison to Jefferson, and even after they did not include this power, even after Jefferson told him, I don't like it, and then he went through why this was a serious problem. You're basically, you're talking about things like paper currency or Rhode Island, for example, and of the one issue you have, there's maybe 999 other ones that you really shouldn't be involved in. So you're basically saying giving them a power to control everything and everything for just 1% of the time. This is not a safe approach at all. I happen to agree with Jefferson on this one as well. But Madison, even after the convention did not approve his plan, even after Jefferson went through this whole process of explaining it to him, he doubled down. He basically said, I'm on board with this. This is what we're talking about. This is what we need, but we didn't get it. Anyway, so here in June 6, 1788, again in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he talks about this, his concern about popular passion, factions, the power of the majority. And he said, in all cases where a majority are united by common interests or passion, the rights of the minority are in danger. So this idea of mob rule, two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, you're going to have a bad result if you're the sheep, unless you're standing strong and you got some friends to fight back ultimately. And here he is again. This is June 6, 1788. He said, on a candid examination of history, we shall find that turbulence, violence, and abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority have produced factions and commotions, which in republics have more frequently than any other cause produced despotism. So he thought that a mob rule, a pure democracy, rule by faction, basically all the kind of stuff that we're really living under today, even though we're not supposed to be, He said that it's the number one cause of despotism. So maybe we can say Madison was absolutely correct in calling how this would play out if it went this way. But he put a lot of time into trying to create a system that would prevent that kind of thing. He did not want to have to resort to the people to enforce things all the time, but he recognized that ultimately they were the final authority. The people of the several states held final authority. And he did not want to see factions. So one of his most famous papers, today at least, is Federalist number 10. And here from Mike Meharry, he says, Madison makes his first contribution to the Federalist Project with Federalist 10, taking up the same subject that Alexander Hamilton tackled in Federalist number 9, the Union as a safeguard against domestic faction and insurrection. So faction and then insurrection were leaning towards things like Shays' Rebellion. This was early on in the Federalist Papers because this was a huge motivation for why they were even having this convention in the first place. So Meharry continues. He says, Federalist 10 counts as among the best known of the Federalist Papers and showcases Madison's intellect. The paper features some truly impressive political reasoning. And here's one highlight. He's talking about how he defines a faction. He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So any group of people organizing together, dominated or driven by impulse of passion or interest to basically dominate the rights of other people. Now, sometimes it starts at a small group. They don't get real far, but in essence, today we're ruled by faction A versus faction B, and many times faction A and B are united. Just they don't sound the same maybe on the surface, but underneath it all, they are definitely there. So Meharry again points, in his article on this, again, this will be linked to in the show notes, he says that Madison points out that factions are going to exist. You can't eliminate them. He went through a kind of a discussion in Federalist 10. Can you get rid of them? He's like, no, because really the only way to do that would be to destroy freedom of choice. And that's really that's like a result or a solution that might be worse than the result. And Meharry writes, Madison concludes, quote, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. He thinks this is just part of human nature that people will organize into groups. And we see this all through history. He said, and Madison points out that people divide into parties due to different opinions. And he uses parties and factions almost interchangeably sometimes due to different opinions concerning religion, government, and many other points, along with attachment to different leaders. These divisions, quote, inflamed them with mutual animosity and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So the solution for Madison was not to get rid of factions because people are going to organize into groups one way or another. If you have to tell people they're not allowed to do that, you're going to come up with some real problems. But he said this, the inference to which we are brought is this, that the causes of faction cannot be removed and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. And he felt that you could have a large republic rejecting probably all the way back to Plato and small republic theory about having a republic only being a small organization. But he thought you could have a larger republic with checks and balances, separation of power, and the like in order to control the effects of these factions. Now, Meharry talks about how, well, in essence, he didn't really call it. I think Madison actually missed the mark on this, and that probably would make for a good episode in and of itself. Now, in Federalist number 49 and 50, Madison again rejects the notion of going back to the people at large, the whole of the country, even if it's through the several states altogether, for either periodic or occasional appeals to the people through national conventions for, quote, preventing and correcting infractions of the Constitution, or as he put it specifically in Federalist 50, for enforcing the Constitution. He did not want to see a constitutional convention used as a tool to enforce the Constitution, because if you had to do that, you've got a problem. Now, he said, of course, you can use it to amend the Constitution to change the amount of powers, either add powers or reduce powers. But if government is not following the rules, and if the people aren't putting people in office to follow the rules, and you're having to resort to a convention to correct abuses, you've got a serious, serious problem. He specifically said it's a very, very bad choice. Now, first of all, in Federalist number 50, if I can pull this up here, he said it just isn't going to work. And this is how he put it. Is it to be imagined that a legislative assembly consisting of 100 or 200 members, eagerly bent on some favorite object and breaking through the restraints of the Constitution in pursuit of it, would be arrested in their career by considerations drawn from a censorial revision of their conduct at the future distance of 10, 15, or 20 years? So he's basically saying the short version of this is, well, conventions, a constitutional convention, an Article 5 amendments convention, this is a long process. It's not something that you can deal with quickly. And if people are breaking through the restraints of the Constitution, he says, are they going to be stopped under the notion that in 10, 15, 20 years down the line, what they're trying to do is going to be blocked by a convention of the states? He's like, this is just dumb to think of, really. He said, in the next place, the abuses would often have completed their mischievous effects before the remedial provision would be applied. So they're going to put this stuff in place. They're violating the Constitution. And if you have to enforce the Constitution through a 10, 15, or 20-year project to amend the Constitution to fix the problem that they created, you've got that stuff on the books. And the odds of actually changing the document in order to correct the document is probably not going to be real effective either. He said, in the last place, where this might not be the case, they would be of long standing and would have taken deep root and would not easily be extirpated. So in other words, once you have the precedent of the power, people don't like getting rid of things. And you can hear people who say, we heard for many years, TEA meant taxed enough already, as if the modern Tea Party rejected the notion of the original one that internal taxes were a problem in and of itself. We're okay with everything that's been up to this point. We don't want to get rid of Social Security or Medicare. Hands off of those things. Who cares what the Constitution had to say? I paid in. I deserve to get mine back. Even though I was forced to pay in, they would come and get me if I tried to get out of it. This is a bad mentality, and we recognize that the idea of trying to fix things that have been long established is very difficult. And then again, in Federalist 50, he gave an example of how it would play out based on how it did play out in Pennsylvania in 1783 and 84. He said, every page of their proceedings witnesses the effect of all these circumstances on the temper of their deliberations. Throughout the continuance of the council, it was split into two fixed and violent parties. So when you have to go to a convention of the people in order to enforce the Constitution, then you're going to end up with people dividing into Party A versus Party B, and then you have a really bad situation. Again, he said, unfortunately, passion, not reason, must have presided over their decisions. So ultimately, Madison is an interesting character. And Madison, along with many of the other Federalists, had this same type of a view. You create a system that is going to reduce the need to resort to the people all the time. But ultimately, you have to resort to the people because the people are at the top of the food chain. So this nuanced thing, I've got a few points here in my notes. First of all power comes from the people. So then the people have the final say over the government, but the people tends towards faction and parties and passion and ultimately violence and mob rule. So all through history, that destroys the liberties, the rights of the people in the minority faction. So it's essential to create a system where appeals to the people to enforce the Constitution, appeals to the people at large, aren't needed all the time. And if that's the case, they're just going to divide into factions and you're going to end up destroying liberty anyway. So for us today, we've got kind of the worst of both worlds. We've got a situation where enforcement of the Constitution is not happening through the forms of the Constitution. It's not even close to it. The largest government in history is nowhere close to an enforced Constitution. So the people need to step up all the time, but at the same time, the people are terrible on liberty. They are formed into factions. They think in faction first, or party first, or individual first, not individual liberty, but an individual leader first, and they just are not in favor of liberty. And so any appeal to the people at large could make things worse. It's a very, very difficult situation, but this is the kind of information that we feel is absolutely necessary to get out to more and more people. No one's taught this kind of thing in government-run schools. I know I was never taught the idea that it was something outside the government that has to keep the government in check. We were just told, just go through the system and somehow magically, well, they weren't these words, but in essence, somehow magically, if you get enough people on board and you make enough signs and you vote hard enough, you're going to convince the government to stop doing the things that the government wasn't supposed to do in the first place. Well, that has been a completely failed strategy, so we need to discuss other things. And there's nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do want to say a quick but a huge thank you to just a few people who have joined us as members recently. I couldn't be more grateful for your support. There's Stephen in Texas, Lewis and Bonnie. Lewis in Florida, Bonnie in Florida, and Fiona in Tennessee. Thank you so much. Again, 10thAmendmentCenter.com/members is where you can join them and join us. Again, $2 a month for monthly. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I'm running a little bit long today, but I really appreciate you being here. I hope you found this interesting and educational. That's more important than anything. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed geeking out and putting this together and sharing it with you today. Again, 10thAmendmentCenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find the blog post for this episode in the next couple of hours. I hope you have a great day. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.